Today we're going to look at what the Dust Bowl was like, specifically with a deeper look into the lives of the Okies, but mostly just what caused the Dust Bowl, how it was, how life for the Okies was, who they were, and a little bit into the aftermath of that. And this is by me, Leica Adari. Now, we have to know some background information to truly understand exactly what caused the Dust Bowl. So, going back to the Roaring Twenties, this was a time of extreme economic prosperity, and it was right after the World War, and the economy was just booming, and life was good. It was even called the Golden Twenties, and the stock market was expanding, and people were putting a lot of money into the stock market. Now, unfortunately, in 1929, the stock market reached its peak and then it crashed. So, everyone who had invested in the stock market was just, it was irreparable. They could not get their money back. And this is what launched the country into the Great Depression, which was a time of extreme economic degeneration, and the banks were bankrupt, and unemployment was insane. And this time lasted until about the mid 1940s. Um, by the year after the stock market crashed, 800 banks went bankrupt, and people just could not get their life savings out of it. It was as good as gone, and that was only the beginning. It got worse as time went on. So during this time, agricultural production prices were low, and they were low even in the 1920s, but they were high during the World War. And during World War One, there was like this extreme need for wheat. So people were growing lots and lots of wheat, and they were like, okay, wheat is selling really well, so we can sell more. So they like scaped all of the Great Plains, which used to grow buffalo plants, and started to grow wheat instead. And they were selling this during the time of the First World War, and it was selling. But after the World War was over, it wasn't selling so much. And during the 20s, the prices started to go down for crops extremely, and farmers didn't want to give up the profit that they had been making, so to make up for it, they started to grow even more wheat, which supply and demand that made the prices go down further. So this was an extremely terrible time for the farmers, the 20s, and then during the Great Depression, things only got worse. So as wheat wasn't selling, they pulled their crops out, and the cattle grazed the land and left the land barren. And the grass had originally, the buffalo grass that was there in the beginning before the wheat, kept the soil in place. But when all of the wheat was grown in such an excess amount, it exhausted the topsoil. And that was the only thing that had been grown there, so all the topsoil was loose. And then the wheat wasn't grown there anymore, so there was nothing to hold the soil down. And then in 1931, the drought hit. So the water wasn't pouring, and the soil wasn't um, dense like it would be when it's wet. It wasn't like dirt, it was just like dust. So the heavy winds that started to come began to pick up the soil, and they would just blow them for hundreds of miles. And all people could see during these dust storms, were dust. They couldn't see anything else, and they even began to start being called black blizzards because that's all that you could see from them. So that's how the dust storms began, with that whole agricultural aspect from the Great Depression and everything. Because there was nothing to hold the soil down, as soon as the drought hit, it was just chaos, and the storms were insane, like nothing we had ever seen. So during the dust storms, this Great Plains was the place that was affected the most, which was about a 150,000 square foot area. So you can only imagine how big that must have been. It covered parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, and even extended to other regions during the entire duration of this period, which lasted from 1931 to 1939. So it was a really long time, and farming was basically shot because there's dust storms all the time. You can't really go out and farm consistently, and even if you could during some better periods of time, there was a drought. So farming wasn't really an option for the majority of this period. Later, they did put in the AAA, but we'll get to that later, which did increase farming. But for the most part, farming was dead. And even when people could farm, they weren't making enough profit for it to be worth it. So people just had to stay indoors. They would wear masks and not gas masks, but they would wear masks and things on their face to avoid the dust from going into their bodies. And coupled with the Great Depression, it was the hardest time that the US had ever seen. It was just accumulation of things that come together was the worst. Um, okay, so the Okies. Yes, the dust storms covered the Great Plains, but you primarily remember it covering Oklahoma, because that was where some of the most dense dust storms were. It was like the center of the Great Plains. I don't want to say the center, but it was definitely a big. It was one of the major victims of the dust storms. So the Okies were people who were from the Great Plains, specifically Oklahoma, who traveled west in order to find a better life for themselves. They were called the Okies, and that's defined by the Free Dictionary as impoverished migrant farm workers, especially ones who left Oklahoma during the Depression of the 1930s to work elsewhere in the U.S., specifically westward. Now, 300 to 400,000 of these people all migrated west in search of a better life for themselves. Now, some of the Okies headed to cities, but most went west, primarily to Washington and Oregon, specifically California. Now, California was advertised as the place with the perfect climate with an abundance of agricultural jobs. And it was advertised as the place looking for migrant workers for agriculture. So naturally, the Okies, who had been farmers when, they could farm in the Great Plains, they leapt at this chance to find work for themselves because they were out of work. And California ended up having up to 7,000 new migrants a month, which was definitely a lot more than it had needed. So when the migrants arrived expecting work, they really didn't have, a lot of the times, they didn't have work to come to because competition was so stiff and there were so many more migrants than there was work. And although there was work, but sometimes in cotton and things like that, it wasn't enough based on how many migrants were coming in. It was almost false advertising just because the reception to the advertising was so much more than California could offer. So the Okies had an extremely hard time, and in 1936 specifically, migration became so bad that, according to livinghistoryfarm.com, the LAPD sent 136 deputies to the state lines to turn back migrants who didn't have any money. So people who were coming in looking for work, they were sending them away because they just could not handle the excess of people. And bordering states of California like Arizona and probably Nevada were angry that California was trying to dump the hobos back on them. So these Okies were looking for work and they just weren't getting any type of reception because the country was so deep into the Great Depression that no one had that kind of room to house these people, feed these people, give them work. It wasn't plausible, it wasn't practical, and they were really they didn't have anywhere to go. Eventually, the police were returned to LA and the migrants just had to be allowed into the state. But the Okies were disappointed because they didn't, even though they were allowed into California, they weren't able to find jobs. And even though, yeah, they escaped the Dust Bowl, the West was so deep in the Great Depression that situations weren't much better for them. In some cases, they might have been worse. So here are some quotes from Okies that kind of just give some insight as to exactly what life was like for them. A letter from an Oklahoma woman, which was published in Reader's Digest magazine, recalls that in June of 1935, she said this: "In the dust-covered desolation of our no-man's land here, wearing our shade hats with handkerchiefs tied over our faces and Vaseline in our nostrils, we have been trying to rescue our home from the wind-blown dust. It is almost a hopeless task, for there is rarely a day when at some time the dust clouds do not roll over. Visibility approaches zero, and everything is covered again with a silt-like deposit which may vary in depth from a film to actual ripples on the kitchen floor. So she just kind of talks about exactly how extensive the dust was, how horrible visibility was, exactly how thick it was, how dense it was, how omnipotent it was, because for that decade that was all that there was dust, and you get to see, kind of get a little bit of insight just exactly how bad that was, because no matter how much we talk, it's not, you can never know what that was like, but this kind of gives you a little perspective as to exactly how bad it was. And another woman, Florence Thompson, who left Oklahoma in 1925 before the Great Depression, explains just how her migration was. She said that it was very hard and cheap. We just existed. We survived. Let's put it that way. So you kind of get to know that they weren't really living, because Thompson left Oklahoma and she got away from the dust, but they couldn't find job and they didn't have money, and they weren't really living, the way that you and I live. We live with luxury and we live with indulgences, and they didn't have that. They just lived to survive. And I think that survival is something completely different from living, and this period of time was extremely difficult. And it wasn't just one or two people, it was, I hate to say everybody, but it was everybody. The entire country was going through the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, and things were just unbearable. Now, yes, eventually the Dust Bowl, we got out of it. Now, beginning in 1935, federal conservation programs such as Roosevelt's New Deal's AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, were created to rehabilitate the Dust Bowl. And what they did was they changed basic farming methods of the region by seeding areas of grass, rotating crops, and using counter plowing, strip plowing, and planting shelter belts of trees to break the wind. And the way they encouraged people to do this was by taxing people who didn't. So people who were planting the staple crops that, one, did not sell, and two, was bad for the soil, were taxed. And farmers were defensive when they, were criticized for doing this, for not planting the staple crops and stuff. But when they were paid, they started to put the techniques into practice. But because they were being taxed, the Supreme Court determined that the AAA was unconstitutional, and that this was not the way to encourage this kind of crop growth, and therefore it was disbanded. And in 1936, the worst dust storm hit. It came to be known as Black Sunday, and the great winds carried dust as far as Washington, D.C., which I guess finally opened the Congress's eyes to really try and do something about it. So they passed the SCS, or the Soil Conservation Act, which encouraged diverse group crop growth like the AAA did, but instead of doing it by taxing farmers who didn't abide by these conditions, they started encouraging farmers who did by paying them, which was definitely considered constitutional. And slowly but surely, prices began to go up, and the increase in farming in the Great Plains began to hold the soil down. And after the worst dust storm in 1936, the storms began to dwindle down until 1939, when the drought and the Dust Bowl officially came to an end. So now what happened was, because the crop growth was diverse and they were rotating the crop growth and things like that, the soil was getting some of its nutrients back, and it wasn't so loose. The topsoil wasn't so loose as the wheat crops had left it. So it was staying down, and it wasn't the best, but it started lessening because there were roots to hold it down. And by 1939, when the drought was officially over, it became much better because rain was falling, crops were growing, the soil was back almost to the way that it was before, and things were looking up. The Dust Bowl had essentially ended, and over time, the Great Plains were restored. Now, the Dust Bowl definitely affects lives today. Now, the SCS, which was established to promote the healthy soil management and farming practices and paid farmers to put such practices to work on their farms, still exists today, and their legacy practices such as irrigation, crop diversity, and no-till farming still continue in the plains today. So those practices have lasted since then. And additionally, the Great Plains are no longer barren and are home to immense grasslands, which after the scare that the Dust Bowl was, of course, they're not going to be left barren. Now, in 1937, the Works Progress Administration was passed, and it was reported that the drought or the Dust Bowl was the principal reason for economic relief as assistance in the Great Plains region during the 1930s. So, and the Work Progress Administration was the New Deal Act that played the largest role in pulling the country out of the Great Depression. So we can kind of credit the pulling of the country out of the Great Depression to the Work Progress Administration, and consequently the dust storms of the 1930s. So it's still our current economic standing today is definitely a result of that. So that's how the Dust Bowl kind of still plays a little bit of an effect into how things are today. So these are just a couple of pictures. You can see on the picture on the right the graph that immigration reached an all-time low between 1930 and 1939. So people were not coming into the U.S., one, because of the Great Depression, and two, because of the Dust Bowl. Of course, that was a time that was not, America just was not desirable. It wasn't attractive. No one wanted to come here because things were so bad. Yes, the Great Depression was felt globally, but the dust storm wasn't. The dust storms were only felt in the U.S., and that had a lot to do with why immigration was so low. And as you can see from this graph, that since since times recorded in the 1820s, that was the lowest immigration time by far. Times where it was drastically decreasing until the dust storms hit, and it started drastically increasing as soon as they were over. So you can see exactly how that played into immigration patterns of the time. Additionally, the image right here, this on the left, the top image on the left, shows just where the Dust Bowl was. Now, the heart of the Dust Bowl in the Great Orange is primarily in Oklahoma, with a little bit of Texas, Kansas, and a little bit in Colorado and New Mexico, but most of it is in this area right here, primarily Oklahoma. And other areas were severely affected as it, became like these areas also felt the effects, not as severely, of course, but felt the effects nonetheless. And that just gives you like a visual as to how the Dust Bowl, where the Dust Bowl primarily was. Now, this picture right here shows the migration patterns that were primarily seen in the time of the Dust Bowl. People, went from Oklahoma as far as Illinois, or as far as Los Angeles primarily, and this was a heavily migrating place. People were just moving, trying to get away from the Dust Bowl, which, as you can see here, was right about in this area. So people were trying to get away, and they would migrate away from there. Now, there's some image that you can kind of see not exactly, but you can kind of see what the Dust Bowl was like. So this just shows you, the dust storms and how massive and all-encompassing they were. This is an image that shows two people who are, migrating, and they're migrating on foot because, remember, these people did not have any money, but they migrated as far as California from Oklahoma without money. And so a lot of the times they'd hike on the train, or they'd hitch rides and things like that, but a lot of the time people were, walking or in caravans. It was not, travel was difficult, but they did it because they thought that the hope that they had was better than the dust storms. And unfortunately, that hope was unwarranted because California was feeling the depression, and work was not much better there. So these three women are wearing masks to kind of shield, their mouths and their nostrils from the dust. And this was not an uncommon sight back then. So you can kind of see just how bad and common and everyday and all encompassing the dust storms really were. So here are two videos. They're relatively short. This is called The Dust Bowl, a film by Ken Burns, and we can kind of see by PBS, and we can kind of let's just watch it.
This fall on PBS, they had come to the far edge of the Great Plains in search of a new beginning, in the last place in America where a family could claim a homestead and build a future.
We had the best crop that we had in 1929, and everything was looking up.
A sea of grass, once the domain of Indians and buffalo, disappeared beneath the blade of a plow.
I saw the whole country transformed in the sunset glow. All the brown prairie turned to gold.
But then it was as if the land rejected them. The rains stopped and the winds came.
We saw this cloud coming in, black dirt. And I'll never forget my grandmother. She said, "You kids run and get together. The end of the world's coming."
It came like a black wall, a tide of destruction that crashed over the broken plains, choking the life out of everything in its path.
You never really escaped the dust. It always found its way in. And that's, I think, what drove people crazy.
Some would pull up stakes and move on, but most stayed, always looking to the promise that next year would be better.
We were just too selfish, and we were trying to make money, and it didn't work out.
Ken Burns tells the story of a generation that was buried and what it took to dig out. The Dust Bowl starts Sunday, November 18th at 8, 7 Central, only on PBS.
So that was just a preview on to Ken Burns' films that are premiering on PBS, and definitely go watch those if you want to get a deeper understanding of the Dust Bowl. But in the preview itself, you can kind of get a little insight as to how terrible the dust storms really were, and how much of a role greed played in them. Because the reason that in the beginning the wheat farming was so extensive, and we'll get onto that a little bit later in the conclusion, was because people wanted to make as much money as they could while they were making it, and that's what stripped the land of its resources and set the series of events that would lead into the dust storm. So this is also another PBS video.
We're continuing Mr. Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl songs from Texas, Oklahoma, and California.
As I rambled around over the country and kept looking at all these people, seeing how they lived outside like coyotes, around in the trees and timber and under the bridges and along all the railroad tracks and in their little shack houses that they built out of cardboard and tow sacks and old corrugated iron that they got out of the dumps. It just struck me to write this song. I ain't got no home, I'm just a roaming round.
During the 10 years of the Great Depression, California's population would grow more than 20%. Half of the newcomers came from cities, not farms. 1 in 6 were professionals or white-collar workers. Of the 315,000 who arrived from Oklahoma, Texas, and neighboring states, only 16,000 were from the Dust Bowl itself. But regardless of where they actually came from, regardless of their skills and their education and their individual reasons for seeking a new life in a new place, to most Californians and to the nation at large, they were all the same, and they all had the same name.
Okies, and we were made fun of, and you talk funny, and all of that. Or talk some more. You talk funny, and you hated that because it set you apart.
There was a sign in a movie theater in the Central Valley of California, which basically said niggers and Okies upstairs. That is, you can't sit down here with real people.
They were horribly mistreated. In some cases, they were treated the way blacks were treated in the South. There were signs similar to the signs they had in Dalhart, Texas, that said, "Black man, don't let the sun go down on you here." Similarly, there were signs all throughout the Central Valley saying, "Okie, go back, we don't want you."
So that video is a little more specific to exactly what the Okies had to deal with. And like I previously mentioned, they weren't wanted in California or anywhere because they were competition. They were hobos a lot of the time, as they were referred to, and they were extremely mistreated and set apart, like the woman said. So those are the two videos. They're pretty short, just about the Dust Bowl, what caused it, its effects, how specifically the Okies felt about it, and moving on to the conclusion. Now, as historian Robert Worcester wrote, the ultimate meaning of the dust storms of the 1930s was that America as a whole, not just the plains, was badly out of balance with its natural environment. Unbounded optimism about the future, careless disregard of nature's limits and uncertainties, uncritical faith in providence, devotion to self aggrandizement, all these were national as well as regional characteristics. Like I said, the Dust Bowl was caused by the extreme wheat production of the First World War, coupled with dropping prices during the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression and the drought of the 1930s. Now, Robert Worcester is referring to the extreme wheat production because people ignored the effects that it would have on the land and produced it in such abundant amounts because of greed and a desire for more and more profit. At the time of the First World War, wheat was selling and people wanted to capitalize and maximize their profits, so they just grew more and more and more with, like he says, careless disregard of nature's limits and devotion to self-aggrandizement. And that's exactly what it was. And that wasn't just one people, it was a national ideal. We had just won the World War, people were patriotic, people were happy, people didn't care about exactly how much nature could take, and they wanted to capitalize and maximize on the good times, which were the Roaring Twenties. And the fact that the Great Depression set in, and so did the Dust Bowl, just shows how careless that was. And that's kind of how the Dust Bowl came to be, to conclude. And ultimately, the Dust Bowl, coupled with the Great Depression, created what Timothy Egan, the author of his New York Times notable book, The Worst Hard Time, calls the worst hard time. Because as far as the U.S. is concerned, this time was the worst hard time. Poverty was extremely high, unemployment was extremely high, and there was no escaping it. I said low, but I meant high. People were surrounded by dust, and when they tried to escape, as the Okies did, they couldn't because they were just met with the effects of the Great Depression. There was just no escaping the worst hard time. So these are some of the my works cited and my works consulted. You can go ahead and check these out yourself if you want to get a more extensive look into exactly what the worst hard time, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, the Okies, what life was like back then, and what effects that had, and what caused it, and things like that. You can go and check these out yourself, and that's basically it. So thank you, and goodbye.